So it's my great pleasure now to present our guest speaker. Dr. Peter Warrian is a distinguished research fellow at the Innovation Policy Lab, located at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. He is Canada's leading academic expert on the steel industry. His current research is on knowledge networks, supply chains, and engineering labor markets. In 2016, he published a profile of the steel industry, and in 2017, along with Mike Smitka, he published a profile of the global auto industry. Both books are available from Business Expert Press. I'm very pleased to add that Peter is a member of the Harris Center's advisory board, where his contributions are always very wise and very well received. Peter has a summer home in Salvage and had planned to deliver his presentation to us in person, but urgent family matters have taken him away and he's had to go to Toronto earlier. So through the magic of technology and the magic of John Duff behind the screen there, like the Wizard of Oz, we're making this happen. So Peter, I'm delighted to turn things over to you, and away you go.
All right. Good morning, everyone. So the first slide, what I want to talk about MUN and transferring knowledge into the Newfoundland and Labrador economy. Next slide. I'll try to do that in 5 short sessions. One, talk about the new economics of universities. Secondly, how we frame and measure knowledge transfer, referencing TRLs or technology readiness levels. Thirdly, what we learned from a look we did in the past year at Seacore and then another at the Marine Institute. And I'll conclude with some comments about the implications for innovation policy. So let me go to the next slide. So the new economics of universities, particularly focusing on knowledge transfer. Next slide. So economists of knowledge transfer and economics of science, there are such people, really talk about the modern university in terms of 3 channels of knowledge transfer. The first, the familiar one, scientific knowledge through professional publications, sometimes patents. Secondly, embedded knowledge, that is what's in the heads of university graduates. Some people want to argue that the biggest transfer of knowledge is commencement day. Thirdly, interactive knowledge takes place through social networks, consultancy, best practices, etc. The importance of that is, well, a lot of airtime goes to intellectual property rights, and I realize MUN is revising its IP policy. It is mostly about transfer channel number 1, scientific knowledge. 2 and 3 are largely ignored, and I think that's a mistake. What I'm actually going to argue to you, this may be the first takeaway. Most people, in talking about knowledge transfer in the university, both inside and outside, talk a lot about the IP policy. And there's, in Canada, there's the famous debates about the Waterloo IP policy, and all universities, including MUN, have been revising it. My point here that I'll return to in a few minutes, that attention may be overdone. I mean, obviously the university should do whatever it can to improve its IP policy and its effectiveness, but just focusing on the scientific knowledge transfer, which is where most of that goes, may be misplaced. And 2 and certainly 3 are largely ignored and ought not to be. Next slide. So the importance of that is that across a lot of industries and a lot of technologies, we have a different view of this taking place. Particularly with social media and mainstream media, we've got images of knowledge creation and innovation that focus about either 2 kids in the garage or the young woman in the test tube. However, across a lot of industries and a lot of technologies, it's a fairly consistent pattern. The invention and the discovery science part of the piece is about 15%. That is, if you measure the long-term impact of productivity or efficiency impact of the widget, about 15% of that comes from the invention or discovery stage. About 85% of it comes from learning by doing. And that is reinforcement to me that focusing just on the IP is usually an argument of economic rents arising from the 15%. 85% of the gains come from learning by doing. And that's why things like the students, what happens to them, their role, but also these other channels of knowledge transfer. And it's particularly the case with the Marine Institute. We need to learn from that a whole lot more. So yes, we should try to improve the effectiveness of the university's IP policy, but the main game, the main impact is actually the 85%. And transparency, my efforts, my work, my research is largely about understanding better the 85%. Next slide. The next thing, by way of background, I want to point out is when we talk about an innovation ecosystem, in an ecosystem, there are these multiple channels and pathways of knowledge transfer and innovation: engineering, labor markets, social networks, role of intermediate institutions like labs, associates, consortia, but also standards and regulations, and role of small and large firms. It's that bundle of things that we need to direct our attention at, and particularly, I'm going to argue later, understanding the unique positioning of MUN as a very embedded mid-sized university in the country actually positions, and this is takeaway number 2, positions MUN better than a very large research-intensive university, frankly, like Toronto. I'll come to that. But so understanding MUN in its context, this is what I mean by that. The second point here that some people may want to argue, but it's our point of departure at the Innovation Policy Lab at the U of T, is most innovations that have major impacts across the economy and over time come from incumbent organizations. If you like, they come from spin-outs of people and technologies from incumbent organizations, not startups. Most startups fail, but they may lead to something else. But while startups tend to grab all of the attention time, sometimes for politicians, sometimes in the official media and the stories, actually the long-term trajectory of innovation that affects the economy as a whole tends to be things that come out of people and technologies. Now, they may move out of their coming organizations, but the core of that, again, is not the 2 kids in the garage. The core of that is people and technologies within existing organizations. Next slide. So the second major area is, in talking about knowledge transfer, how do we frame that and how do we measure that? And that's why I'll talk in this section and then later about Seacore and MUN in terms of Seacore and MI about technology readiness levels. Because technology readiness levels have become the lingua franca for innovation policy in the country, in North America, in Europe, etc. Next slide. Where did that come from? Well, some of you may be old enough to recall the Challenger disaster in 1986 and the terrible disaster that happened at Cape Canaveral or Cape Kennedy when the Challenger blew up. That was such a tragic event. It was such a monumental challenge to NASA that in the next 5 years, they went through everything with a fine-tooth comb of why did that happen. And what they decided originated actually with one guy at NASA, that you needed to understand the readiness levels of different kinds of technology. And frankly, they found in the Challenger rocket that you had literally hundreds of technologies, all of which were at different stage of readiness. And in some respects, it's lucky the thing flew the 10th time, the first time, let alone it blew up in the 10th time. So what we now assume goes back actually 30 years to the dissecting of the Challenger disaster, and that's now formulated in what's called TRLs or TRL scales. Next slide. This is a standard technology readiness scale. You can find it in the Government of Canada. You can find the equivalent from the European Commission. Or next slide. This is the one from the Pentagon. And even to this day, The best single way, if you're wanting to operationalize TRLs, is to get the manual from the Pentagon. It's actually a free downloadable. Let's go to the next slide, which really is, how do we apply this? So as I said, the technology readiness scales have become the lingua franca of research policy in Canada, but also around the world. In the Canadian case, the innovation policy has been especially, it started under Prime Minister Harper and it carried on under the Trudeau administration. It's innovation as commercialization, i.e. assessing research or funded research is increasingly become, what does it do to commercialize technology? And well, Canada has had a historical good record for funding basic research. It's had its up and down, it's getting some renewal, but really from innovation policy and where the funding formulas are tilting is towards commercialization. And the metrics for that most often are TRLs. It affects funding criteria, program and project evaluation, even competitiveness. The university challenge is managing different innovation trajectories. That is, traditionally, universities have focused on TRL 1, 2, 3, which is basic science discovery and formulation of some basic concepts. But 4 to 7 is where the commercialization takes place. Next slide. So if these are actual data from a large university in central Canada that you'll probably know of, but I won't identify. Traditionally, if you went back 25 years, if you look at the distribution of the funds for research in universities, it was traditionally weighted in these 1, 2, 3, a little bit in 4. If you took a university today, 2016, and these are actual data, you will see the spread across the towards the right end of the TRL spectrum. The importance of that, next slide, is this. In terms of how research funding takes place, the fundamental research, certainly 1, 2, 3, and maybe 4, is assumed to be 100% public. 5 to 7, which is the industrial funding that often is related to prototyping, etc., is maybe ideally 50-50 public-private. And the last, 8 and 9, 8 is large-scale, small-scale production, 9 is mass markets, where it's directly in commercialization. That's assumed to be private funding. The devil is always in the details, but that is the overlay from the public policy and public funding. Next scale. Next slide. What has happened in where we are right now, and intensely so, I would argue, is competing for research dollars is going on in this band of 4, 5, 6, 7. Now, the Trudeau government has opened the door for funding at 8. Just to divert for a moment, 8 is particularly important for SME firms, small, medium-sized enterprises, because it's getting that first 500 widgets out into the marketplace to test and develop in interaction with their customer bases. So 7 and 8, that most traditional NSERC funding, etc., will stop you short of that. But the Trudeau government has opened its door part way towards 8, particularly because that's seen as uniquely identified with the needs of SME firms. And I'll come back to that, because takeaway number 3 for you is that if there's one area that preoccupies policy shops across the country, be it frankly liberal, conservative, NDP governments or whatever, is how, for the Canadian economy as a whole, how do you raise the game and the innovation capacities and performance of SME firms? They may have their different ways to say it, but that's the central policy proposition occupying policy shops across the country. And that's why these small things may appear small on the chart, but they have big consequences. Next slide.
Peter, can you clarify what BLRN means?
Business-led research networks. Business-led research networks. So universities are increasingly competing not with other universities, but with business-led research networks. Okay? So here's the connection. If you go to any SME management group or an industry gathering, they'll talk to you continuously about the valley of death, getting across the valley of death. That is from on the left end of the curve, the expenditures on initial expenditures on R&D versus towards the right end of the scale, commercialization and getting revenues in the marketplace. And how do they get across this valley of death? And valley of death often, I'll come to it again later, is actually related to roughly TRLs 5, 6, 7, 8. But everyone in the SME space will talk to you about getting through the valley of death and their needs to help bridge that. If you like it, if you want to do the economics, what we want to do is move the R&D funding curve, move it to the right to narrow and shorten the valley of death period. I'll return to that in a few minutes. Next slide. So the other perspective, particularly from our lab, is the nature of the innovation process itself. Innovation isn't simply science or engineering. For us, it's fundamentally a social process, and it's place-based. That's how we assess everything. I think those two particular norms or variables are uniquely important to understanding MUN and the Newfoundland economy. Next slide. So we did two projects in the last year, David Wolf, my colleague, and I. We looked at Seacore and we looked at MI, or the Marine Institute. So again, we can't summarize everything is in the report. The reports are available, but highlights for the purposes of this discussion of both how MUN does knowledge transfer and its impact in the Newfoundland and Labrador economy. Next slide. So we viewed Seacore as the coming thing in policy studies is networked industrial policy. It's not a matter of just the science and engineering end, but actually how it works. And we want to look at Seacore and more broadly Memorial and its contribution to that innovation ecosystem, that broad set of networks that I identified before. And further, I realize I'm going to come from away, but I have been coming to Newfoundland for 20 years. The Newfoundland economy, particularly its institutions, constitute a dense network of local relationships that make up the core of the Newfoundland innovation ecosystem. And it's critical to understanding this business of the social nature of the innovation process. So how do we do that? Next slide. We particularly want to look at the industry partners. And then when we do these studies, David and I, we may spend 1/3 of our time talking to government people and university people. We want to spend 2/3 of their time looking at their industrial partners. So two comments, two areas here, and I can't summarize everything in the report, but look at multinational corporations. What we found was the presence of major and sophisticated industrial partners, like in the offshore. They're usually involved with very specific technical issues, like ice conditions and drilling. They may present opportunities for individual researchers to gain a presence in the international market. But from the perspective of economic development, they don't significantly expand export opportunities for Newfoundland. That was our first view. The second is the large companies, unlike the small companies, do not appear to have IP issues with the MUN. I know it's under revision, but the non-economic policy regime, the innovation policy regime. But the multinationals are much affected by the cycles of the resource economy. So there's major discontinuity in their contribution to the intellectual and organizational capacities in the Newfoundland infrastructure. And quite frankly, in the current environment in Newfoundland, I think the whole research infrastructure in Newfoundland is undergoing a major stress test because of the dynamics and the volatility in the resource sector in particular. Next slide. Different story when you look and talk to the industrial partners, the SMEs, the small companies. They do offer, it's our view, that the greatest opportunities for export development and leading edge technology in specific niches, such as signal processing and resource development and the fishery. And we found it useful to distinguish two things. The maker SMEs, which is established manufacturing and producer companies, fish companies, they have constraints related to internal resources, both financial and human, by a culture of incrementalism. So the trajectory, the innovation trajectory is one of incrementalism. They also tend to see innovations as solely as a cost. Therefore, they tend to use the name from that famous British theater production 10 years ago, can't pay, won't pay. They're at the end of the spectrum. The techie SMEs are startups and softwares are more engaged towards more disruptive technologies and relatively more resources. And they could make the greatest difference for the future of regional economic development, but they're the least engaged and least dependent on money for the sources of new ideas. Next slide. So then further, we wanted to look at Seacore as an organization and found it as a hybrid organization, and it functioned as effectively a business-owned, university-owned, business-led research network. And therefore, it's in the heat of the storm. If we are right in terms of the current policy environments led by the federal government and projecting out to the next 3 to 5 years, because it's really a flat-out commercialization venture rather than just a research institution per se, it's going to be and is in the middle of the eye of the storm in this competition for research resources, going back to a previous slide. At the same time, it's a vital part of the research infrastructure for Newfoundland. Most importantly, and least recognized, is because it's the anchor continuity. The most important single fact about Seacore is it continues to exist. That is, in the face of decades of resource development and sways in government policy priorities, its continuity of personnel, institutional memory, and some of its key data sets from past projects is very much its core aspects. But at the same time, it's faced with managing very different business units with different TRL trajectories. Next slide. So you can see when we went through Seacore and its individual pieces and where they were in their different business units, a very, very heterogeneous, to use a polite phrase, mix of where they are. So some things like card and ice engineering are more towards traditional university sciencey end of the spectrum. And more recent things like remote sensing, look north, are more in the flat commercialization business end of it. And then you've got a core in between. So recalling a few slides back about the traditional university, our view is that because Seacore is this amalgam of past cycles, it reflects that. So what's happening in university funding and university research activity and knowledge transfer is in fact reflected in the heterogeneity of the Seacore as a whole. That may be a good thing for the long-range contribution of the university, but it's a tough thing to manage because of that heterogeneity. Next slide. And that's where we come back to the business. Our current work is mapping these TRLs against the valley of death that all the SMEs want to talk to you about. And really, you'll see the first, TRLs 1 to 3 in the first early stage pre-commercial activity. 4 to 7 is in the R&D thing. 8 and 9 is a transitional into the marketplace. We're trying to tell that story more graphically by individual firm stories, but that's the analytical framework that we're applying to it, tying together the two threads of the more principled conversation we're having a few minutes ago. Next slide. So the Marine Institute, again, there's other things to talk about Seacore. There's lots to talk about the Marine Institute, but we don't take part of the story for purposes of this. Next slide. The best take, because we were doing a Seacore and the Marine Institute. This is actually it's Seacore versus not MUN, but Seacore versus Marine Institute. So you can see the heterogeneous trajectory of Seacore on the left. And the bottom right is this is actually the TRL scales from the Marine Institute. So you can see that the Marine Institute, there's a few areas where they may compete with Seacore, but mostly they're in their own space that is dominated by this key central section of 4 to 6. And I'll come back to that in a second. It's also different from the traditional university. And a section of the report says, we value this very much, by the way, understanding this profile of Marine Institute and how it differs with the university and how the university, frankly, should learn from it. Next slide. So when we looked at the Marine Institute, these are our words, not their words, but it's really a sort of more, instead of a linear commercialization trajectory, MI has basically a more circular economic view of technology. That is 4 to 6. It's a more limited view, but it's a very effective one. That is, Seacore may compete, particularly in their more recent ventures, in competing in the 6 to 9, the flat-out commercialization space. MI is more in the 4 to 6 and then back again. These are small differences that matter, but are really important to understand MUN's over-contribution, and it's a unique contribution by Marine Institute. One, it has more potential to deal with SMEs. I'll come back to that in a minute. Secondly, it has a greater impact on policy and regulations. So, for instance, they may be doing something with the simulators, but that their customer is not the commercial marketplaces. Their customer is actually, their audience is Transport Canada or Fisheries and Oceans, and then an impact through the International Maritime Organization on the regulatory framework that has real impacts on firms, resources, skills, training. But that's a very different trajectory. It also reinforces and is reinforced by the traditional industrial training mandate of the Marine Institute. Next slide. Our view has resulted, and this is based on about 43 interviews. The MI environment, its relationship and the culture are different from the general university. So IP issues are not a big or active issue or disputatious. The Marine Institute has the advantage because of its history, the DNA of its culture, of a much more relational than a transactional approach to working with industrial partners. What I mean by that is in traditional MUN, but also the U of T or wherever, when they approach their IP policy, it's largely transactional. It's about extracting economic rents. The relationship with MI to its industrial policy is more relational and developmental. That's the message, which is maybe the 5th takeaway from this overall presentation. Next slide. As going back to that opening slide about the new economics university, that attention to interactive knowledge as a channel, a neglected channel of understanding the economics of university knowledge transfer and how that contributes in the long term to the economy. This aspect of international knowledge transfer is very much, and it's very evident in the Marine Institutes. This is, in some ways, from a policy perspective, their strongest story. But it also takes place outside the formal IP policy. So going back to that early slide, to the extent that IP's policies are directed at Channel 1, the Marine Institute is very much a combination of 2 and 3. So for us, this Marine Institute becomes really interesting and a very rich story. Going back, though, to the other part, the long-range impact of new invention is a process less from the discovery stage and more from learning by doing. Marine Institute's curriculum delivery its industrial training efforts are critical to this contribution of MUN to the Newfoundland innovation ecosystem. There's much more to develop in this area, but it has a major contribution to better outcomes for the Newfoundland economy. Next slide. So we drilled down how, given that in some respects, Marine Institute has a much closer active relationship and developmental relationship with their industry partners. How does that play? How do the firms view MI, and how does the MI view the firms? So when you interview the firms, what do they get out of this relationship with Marine Institute? The major benefits they saw were access to technical expertise, access to equipment that they themselves may not have, market respectability, strengthening their reputational assets, and information about the technical frontier, perspective on what's coming next. That's the industry's view of what they get from this very rich relationship with Marine Institute. Next slide. Now, how do the MI people view what the firms get out of it? It's a little different. It's on the same page, but different priorities and different configuration of the story. The MI people view the major benefit of industry as leveraging R&D expenditures, technical access to technical expertise, problem solving that are based on very specific practical problems, not academic theory-based issues, and access to equipment, often the testing and analysis equipment. So firms' view of MI and MI's view of firms on the same page, but a bit of a conversation. There's lots to be done to develop that conversation going forward. Next slide. So what does MI get out of it? What does the university get out of it when you ask the companies? Clearly, the first priority by a long shot was leveraging government funding, because so many programs now require private sponsors and contributors. Access to technical expertise. The companies think MI gets that from the companies. The MI folks think the companies get it from the MI, the academic staff, the faculty. Access to equipment and direct funding problem solving. That's familiar from the previous slide. Next. And what does MI get out of it in the view of our MI interviews? Leveraging government funders, direct funding of research costs, wasn't on the other list. Knowledge about, information about the knowledge frontier, wasn't on the other list. And technical expertise was. So again, something that's on the same page, something that my friends of Glenn and Mr. Shea, Dr. Shea, lots to develop there. Our point in doing that was not to identify areas of dispute, but actually where you can develop a longer and a stronger narrative and potentially a strategy going forward. Next slide. So major themes to take away. What clearly distinguishes Marine Institute from MUN and certainly Seacore, its role in knowledge transfer more than just technology transfer as such. That builds on its long tradition of industrial training, which tends to be not highly regarded in some parts of the university, but it's actually important if you've got a modern view of how innovation takes place. MI plays this unique role in the Newfoundland innovation system through its impact on SME firms, industrial training, IRAP assistance. And it really comes down to this issue that Dave and I think a lot about, is if the central policy challenge across the country is how we boost the cognitive capacities and innovation network capabilities of SME firms, Marine Institute's got a unique contribution to make, and we learn from that story ourselves. Next slide. So what can MUN learn from Marine Institute? Well, one, this learning by doing, going after the 85% is really important. And in going after the 85%, when I look at it, Marine Institute has a more natural dancing partnering with the engineering faculty than just the science department as such. And that Marine Institute is probably the best fit for networked industrial policy, which is what academics of industrial policy like at the U of T to focus on. But you have to manage different technology trajectories. Readiness has got its own challenges, and Seacore's got that heterogeneity. The final thing there is to understand the, particular for SMEs, what economists call shared public goods. So the flume tank is a direct case where it directly assists SME innovations in the fisheries and the local economy because it's a unique shared public good. Next slide. So again, for finally the MI, its challenge. So the core for Seacore management is managing this heterogeneity. For MI, it's managing this lumpy trajectory of innovation. So the fisheries at the bottom of the chart, you'll see is this long incremental thing. The ocean safety stuff is basically disaster driven, an ocean ranger or whatever. And the challenge for the institution is getting onto a more sustainable innovation curve without that lumpiness that goes with the others. Next slide. So implications for innovation policy, I'll be done in a few minutes and we can go over to questions. Next slide. So what did we learn? Clearly, MUN and Seacore and lots on MI are embedded in the region. Again, Seacore's contribution to this continuity and institutional memory, but it's affected by these resource cycles. And it has a range of TRLs, but it's got the silo problem. The competition and the real challenge for Seacore is these new business-led networks. For example, the Remap in Toronto, we've done a lot of work on. They leverage their supply chains, they crowdsource their funding, and they have a different IP regimes, something that we may have a further dialogue with Seacore in the future. Next slide. So this business of building regional industrial commons, from Obama's National Manufacturing Institute, their particular focus was on local regional industrial commons, and particularly the community colleges and SMEs. And the Trump administration is continuing this. They haven't thrown it out. The role of shared public goods, we got the flume tank, knowledge creation and technology transfer, but again, not two kids in the garage. If those are the directions of new networked industrial policy as a broad theme, and we're confident in making that statement, that's not particularly favorable to large research institutions like the U of T or the U15. There's problems with timelines, there's problems with SMEs. But MUN, as a regional embedded university, has distinctive advantages as a university. So if our read on the overall shifts going forward on where innovation policy is going in the country, in some ways, MUN, because it's a regionally embedded university, is going to have an advantage in competing with the U of T's of the world. Next slide. So implications, there's this funding shift in dollars from 1 to 4 towards 5 to 7, and the incremental dollars are going into 5 to 7, which is sort of more like the Seacore Marine Institute end of the spectrum than just the traditional universities. So network industrial policies focused on regional economics, a new kind of infrastructure, and I think you have an opportunity in the batteries, and new agents, particularly SMEs and colleges, and particularly this role of shared public goods in accelerating innovation, the innovation capacities of SMEs. Particularly a strong example there is the use of the wave. Glenn, what did you use? The flume tank and the SMEs. I think that's it. Is there one more slide? No, that's the same one. So basically, our pitch is that MUN and these institutions of ours have got their own traditional issues, but are well positioned for the competition of innovation funding going forward. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Peter.